Good evening, one and all. Because it's great to have James Woolford back with us. He's already presented one or two talks to the Mullion Old Cornwall Society. He's not a Mullion boy, he's a Troon boy. I should say Oscar Hill, age 93, was a Troon boy. Born down the hill, out of Churchtown, different age. But James does a lot of research on local topics, and he's bringing to us this evening what he's gleaned about Marconi, specifically Marconi in Mullion. So, over to James.
Good evening. And thank you to Colin. He gives me such a good sort of build-up there. And I'm thinking, oh, crikey, I've got to follow that now and entertain you all. Right, couple of points. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Good, that's a good starting point. And if we could have questions at the end, that'll sort of let me ramble on, and then you can pick up anything that I haven't made clear at the end of it. So what we're going to talk about is Marconi, who one man who you could probably say has touched the lives of everybody here and probably most people in the world with his magic invention, his little magic box that he invented and brought to England. But he's got a special link with Mullion, is that he chose Poldhu as the site for an experimental radio station, and from that he was able to have the first transatlantic communications. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I don't want to talk to you about the technology. I'm not going to baffle you about radio. I want to talk about the man, because he's actually far more interesting, because he's quite an enigma really in himself. So immediately we get to those. Just some general pictures of Marconi. Most of those pictures were all staged for the press in Newfoundland. The other end of the link, yeah. And this gentleman there, we just mentioned him. That's George Kemp, who was Marconi's assistant, but also spent a lot of time in Mullion and helped with the history, put it that way. Now Marconi, he was born Guglielmo Giovanni Maria Marconi on April 25th of 1874. Now, you know, that's April the 25th. Well, a couple of weeks' time, that will have been 150 years ago. So we're coming up to the anniversary, 150th anniversary of Marconi's birthday in a couple of weeks. He was an interesting lad. His mother's side, his mother came from the Jameson whiskey family. So they were well-to-do, they were business people, they had a good business acumen, and they were fairly high up in society. On his father's side, he was an Italian, and born high again, of Italian nobility. So he had a lot of the right contacts high up in social circles in Italy. And the two came together. It was a marriage of love, really. The parents didn't approve. Certainly the Jamesons didn't approve, because she was marrying a foreigner. They were Irish. And she was marrying a foreigner. And eventually they sort of ran away, eloped and got married. But it was quite a successful marriage, really. And they had two sons. There was Guglielmo and his brother Alfonso. There was also a stepson, because Marconi's father had been married before and his stepmother had died. So there was the three. But Marconi was very much, I think you call him a mummy's boy, really. his mum looked after him a lot, and right the way through until he was well into his 20s. And he didn't actually have any formal education. So we've got a man here who's going forward to become marked as a great scientist and a genius. He never had a proper education. He was brought to England by his mother. Him and his brother lived in Bedford, and I'm not too sure why they lived in Bedford, and between the ages of 2 and 6. But he learnt English. He spoke English. Some said he spoke English better than Italian. And certainly, if we've got time, if the technology works, I'll give you a chance to hear a bit of Marconi speaking, because he's just like a BBC announcer, quite frankly, of the period. You wouldn't say he was Italian. So that's the person who came to Mullion, and is probably a reason why he integrated so easily with the people of Mullion. So he didn't actually get any proper qualifications. He wasn't qualified to go to university, on to higher education. But because of his contacts and his mum, he was schooled privately. And one of the people, he showed a very early interest in this modern thing called radio, or we call radio. They called it wireless in those days, but it was communication without wires. They already had the telegraph. That was an established technology. And just as a point, what Marconi was doing was wireless telegraphy, not wireless telephony. So it wasn't speech. So what went from Poldhu across the North Atlantic was dots and dashes. It was Morse code. So it was, and telegraphy was fairly well established, because by that time even Mullion had a telegraph in the post office here, and already there was a telegraph down, especially interesting, down to the Lizard, to the Lloyd's Lizard telegraph station. So he showed this interest, and his mother paid for him, and through her contacts, he was given an introduction to a man called Professor Righi, and he was in the university at Bologna, and he allowed Marconi to sit in on some of the lectures. So although he hadn't qualified, he wasn't able to go to university, he was allowed to sit in on lectures, and he was given the opportunity of talking to somebody who was one of the leaders in the field of wireless in those days. Now, from that, he started experimenting in the house, in the house, the villa. It was big, because, again, his father was wealthy. So the Villa Grifoni, which was near Bologna, and he started off with these experiments, which now, one of Marconi's genius was that he actually didn't invent an awful lot. He got a lot of other ideas, and what he was doing really, and his genius was that he pulled together ideas from other people and made them into something that worked, but better than that, something he could sell. So he was very orientated towards marketing, towards selling something. And people like Maxwell had done all the sums for radio. People like Hertz, a German scientist, he'd done the principles of getting radio waves to travel around a laboratory. He could create them one side of the bench and receive them another. So a lot of the stuff, it was all being built on. This Professor Righi, he was well forward in this. And Marconi got very interested in pulling these ideas together. And he started experimenting at home. And his mum bought him the stuff he needed, the journals to read. And he made stuff in the loft, in the attic of the Villa Grifoni. And he started off, first off, a little wireless transmitter that rang a bell across the other side of the room. And he just moved along. And that was the way Marconi worked, continually just stretching the boundaries, just pushing it along a bit further. And he started off, he could get it to the end of the garden. And with the help of his brother, they'd carry the receiver a little bit further, and it got a bit further. Eventually they got it out of the garden into the woods. Well, that was a bit difficult because what his brother was doing was waving a flag, if it worked. But then they went out of sight around the hill. And the story is that he got the gardener with his 12-bore shotgun around the other side of the hill so that when they received the signal, they would then let the gun off so that Marconi knew. So, but that was really the whole sort of secret of his success. So he'd now got something that worked over a kilometre or so, and he's thinking, well, you know, he could get Morse code across it. Here's something which the military authorities or the communication authorities would be interested in. So he went along to the post office in Italy, the chief postmaster, which again he got contacts to, and they weren't interested. So his mum said, well, why don't we go to England? We've got some contacts over there through the Jameson side of the family. And she brought Marconi to England. Again, through the right contacts he had. And the other interesting part of Marconi's genius, if you like, was he was prepared to listen to advice. He took advice well, which a lot of people in that sort of, you know, circumstances, geniuses, experts, whatever, they tread their own path and ignore everyone else. But what happened, he was advised, his mother first introduced him, or his family, her family introduced him to the Italian ambassador in London. Let's go right to the top. And the ambassador said, look, before you tell anybody how this works, what you've done, how you've made it, get it patented. And he went along through the family. There was a gentleman in the Jameson family who again was part of the business, and he helped Marconi get the patents. So he's got this, demonstrating this, Marconi's magic box, that's what they were calling it. And he was doing demonstration, but he wouldn't let anybody see what was inside this wooden box and how it worked. So they couldn't copy it. They got the patents, and then of course they were protected by law. And that was really the whole secret of the Marconi company, was they protected Marconi's inventions and then fought against anybody who tried to come. But it's quite interesting that his patent was to improvements to wireless telegraphy. So he didn't deny, he didn't say he'd invented it. He pulled together all these other bits that other people had developed, but he got this patent, and that set him up in the world. So that was 1896. He came to London, and one of his contacts was the chief GPO, General Post Office, who were in charge of all the telegraphy and stuff, a William Preece, and he'd taken an interest in wireless, and they again carried on. He started doing demonstrations for the military, because of course, you know, that's something that they immediately saw could be useful. So in 1897, this is still only a young man, he's not 20 at this stage, they formed the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company, and established in 1898 a factory in Chelmsford, which became the home of Marconi. It was a Marconi town. And he carried on. He did demonstrations in London, in the Royal Institution. They then took radios out onto Salisbury Plain, and they're stretching the distance all the time. By March 1899, Marconi had transmitted the first wireless signal across the Channel. So immediately because he's business orientated, he's looking for ways of making money out of this. The telegraph companies, they were well established by now. They had a reliable working service, for instance, you know, across the Channel and across the North Atlantic. So, you know, going out from Cornwall again, there were the cables. They spent a lot of money on this. They'd lost a lot of money, but by this time, they had working systems. But the one thing that the telegraph cable companies couldn't do was talk to ships at sea. And ships were a really useful platform for experimentation as well, because you just kept moving them out and see how far you could get the signal. So he sort of worked this all up. And with sort of international aspirations, he decided he was going to do some demonstrations, and he went off to America, where again they'd established a Marconi company. They'd taken out a lot of American patents as well to protect their rights there. And they covered the American Cup yacht races in 1899 off New Jersey. So they took a ship out, established a radio link back to the land, and were able to give up to the second reports back for the media on how the yacht races were going and who was winning and whatever. So that was a big success. And Marconi is obviously, by this time, he's going across the North Atlantic on the great liners, and he came back on the SS St. Paul that time, which we'll go back to that one again. So that's 1899. In 1900, so we're getting very close to Marconi coming to Mullion, they changed the name of the the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company. It was changed to Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company. Apparently Marconi didn't want that, but it was the rest of the board of directors said, you're the man, you're marketable, you're the person we can sell. And by this time, with what he'd done in America, he was starting to get known, because people were starting to, this name Marconi was appearing in the newspapers. So we're getting to know what it was. So by the summer of 1900, they're thinking of the next steps. They want to talk to ships at sea, and an opportunity comes up. They've started, because on this liner journey back from America, Marconi set up another world first, because he 60 odd miles off the Isle of Wight on their way into Southampton, he managed to telegraph a message from the ship to the shore announcing that they were coming back, and also getting some news, a newspaper, back to the ship for the passengers so they could read the news before they landed, which again, marketable. I think he sold them at a sort of $1 a sheet or something, which is quite a lot of money in those days. So he's looking at ways of making money. The next thing they came up with was, by this time they've got numbers of ships have got Marconi radios on them, and they have built a number of shore stations up as well to support those. Quite smart of the company. They didn't sell the radio stations to the ships, they leased them. They were under contract to the Marconi company. They were only allowed to communicate with Marconi shore stations, and just to make sure, they had a Marconi employee as the radio operator. And so we're looking to make money, and you can see that's the driver all the way through. The next thing they think is, well, down at the Lizard Point there, you've got the Lloyd's Telegraph signal station there. That big white block looks like a bit like a castle. And that was built so that ships coming into England from the Commonwealth, not the Commonwealth then, it was the Empire then, coming back, there were a lot of sailing ships. They knew that they'd left somewhere, like Australia or South Africa. They they had no idea how long they were going to take on the voyage. And when they got back within signalling distance of the Lizard, they would signal the ship's arrival to the Lloyd's signal station there. And originally that was set up it would be done by flags or by semaphore, which meant that the ship had to come fairly close into shore. They would then telegraph from the signal station to Lloyd's of London, who would contact the ship's owners. The ship's owners would arrange the berthing for the ship wherever it was going, say, might even say Liverpool, but it's particularly London. And then they would signal it back again, wave the flags at the ship. But in the meantime, if the gales had gone up to the southwest, there was a good chance that ship might have ended up on the Manacles, which some did. So Marconi comes along and thinks, right, well, we can communicate with our ship to shore 50 or 60 miles now. They don't have to come anywhere near the Lizard. So we set up a radio station just along the shore from the Lloyd station. And those two little black huts there are Marconi's radio station, which he set up for ship to shore. So while they were looking for this, he came down with a guy called Major Flood Page, who was another of the directors of the Marconi's wireless company. And they got in touch with Viscount Clifton, and he was the person who owned the field next to the Housel Bay Hotel, and that's where they set up they arranged the lease of that land, and that's where they set up the radio station there. Interestingly, Marconi were always quite keen on doing things at a low budget, because they were struggling for money. The company, you know, they got big ideas and big backers, but they weren't making an awful lot of profit. And the original hut, the one that's still down, one of the ones that's still down there, was used as a Great Western Railway waiting room on the Lizard Green. And Marconi said, well, that's handy, you know. So he got onto the Great Western Railway and bought it off them and had it carried down to Bass Point. So, you know, they didn't go out their way to buy anything new. So that's where that same hut, that was the old waiting room there. But while they were down here, they've now got some big ideas, because one of the things that science said was that they understood a bit about wireless and the lower frequency radios, and the theorists said, the academics all said, it goes in a straight line like light. They knew that. So there's no way, because the Earth's round, you're going to be able to communicate long distances, because it won't go around the Earth. It's got a, you know, a lot in the way. Well, Marconi, again, partly because of his sort of lack of formal education and this sort of empirical approach to try it and see if it works and then make it better, he managed to get a signal from the Isle of Wight, where he had a radio station, to the Lizard. Now, that was 180 odd miles. That was the furthest that had ever been communicated by wireless at the time. But it also shouldn't have happened, because it went round the curvature of the Earth. It wasn't a straight line. Nobody really understood this, and Marconi, by his own admission, didn't understand how his stuff worked. But he was, you know, he was improving it. So while they're down here, they've also got this really big idea to communicate across the North Atlantic. And it was all a bit secret then, because, you know, they didn't want to come up and say, this is what we're going to do, and be a dismal failure at it. So while he was down, Viscount Clifton has already leased them that piece of land, and they came looking for another piece of land. Now, originally, the first piece of land they looked at was behind the Coast Guard lookout in Mullion, which some people may remember, but at the Mullion Cove Hotel. There's a field behind there, and that was the first place they were looking for. Obviously, there was communication, there would have been possibly telegraph, but certainly telephone links to the Coast Guard lookout hut. But they determined that that field wasn't big enough. And the next field they looked at was Poldhu. And that was also leased from Viscount Clifton at the time, because he basically said, well, I've got lots of land around here, go and see if you can find somewhere that's suitable. That's what they were doing. You'll notice that there's a pattern. The field they chose at the Lizard was right next to a very nice hotel. The one they first looked at in Mullion was right next to a very nice hotel, and the one they chose in the end was right next to a very nice hotel. Marconi wasn't going to slum it. And that pattern, actually, you can look at Marconi radio stations around the world, and they all tend to be quite near to a very nice hotel. But so that was how he ended up in that particular field. They leased it from Viscount Clifton, and there was some names. Major Flood Page was one of the senior managers who came down. There was another man, Richard Vivian, who was also high up on the board, but also an engineer. He was on the engineering side. There was a man called Ambrose Fleming, Professor Ambrose Fleming, who was very high up in academia. He was the person who was involved to build the transmitters. And there was also George Kemp, who was very much Marconi's assistant, personal assistant, and another man called Percy Paget, who had a lot to do down at, he worked here, but he also had a lot to do down at the Lizard. So they've also come up in 1900. They got a way of tuning. This was another of Marconi's patents, because previously you only had basically one radio station operated at a time, and it used the whole band up, and no one else could transmit at the same time. And they tuned it so that they could have more than one radio station working at a time. So that was a big one, because that meant they could experiment and operate at Poldhu and carry on making money at the Lizard at Bass Point, because the Lizard's now making money for them. That's a revenue stream. So we go on to what they're up to. So they come to Mullion, and this is their plan, to build, because basically they want the signals to go further. So they say, let's just make everything bigger and more powerful. It's got to go further then, hasn't it? Again, all the academics are saying, no, it won't go around the world, it won't go around, it can't do it. So they come along to Mullion, and what's really interesting here, this thing here, this original aerial array, is 200 feet high, it's 200 feet across. It's absolutely massive. It's built rather like a ship's mast, you could see, and they actually called them gallants and top gallants. So it was very much. Interestingly, George Kemp had a lot to do with building that. I'm not too sure if he designed it, but his previous career was in the Navy. And I haven't been able to find out whether he was a sort of senior NCO in the Navy or whether he was actually officer rank. I think he was probably senior NCO. But he obviously brought a lot of his knowledge from the Navy into building this mast. But you imagine that nowadays, somebody comes along to Mullion and says, we're going to build an atomic reactor out on the cliffs, you know, and everyone will go, oh no, you know, you can't have that. But I can't really find any great opposition from Mullion to this. I mean, you've got to bear in mind that this is akin to witchcraft in those days. Nobody knew how it worked. It's, you know, it's noisy, as we'll explain. It's a big blot on the landscape. And yeah, but what might have been, everyone's saying, you know, nobody said that their cat wasn't having kittens anymore or something like that. You know, there appeared to be no blame put onto this. And it was totally accepted by the people. And there's a little report there, if you can read it, but it says, it's reported that Marconi, inventor of wireless telegraphy, is about to erect a tower 200 feet high in Mullion for the purpose of sending messages. If the rumour is correct, such an undertaking could mean a lively times for the district. And that's what people, I think, they saw it as an opportunity, because it employed quite a lot of local people. They reckon around about 50 people from Mullion were employed there. But then there was also an awful lot of employment in the hotels, in the local guest houses, and just people lodging engineers as well, to provide that. So there was a good revenue stream for the village from that. Unfortunately, this was built in 1901, and in September we had a little bit of a blow, and it fell down. The whole lot fell down. It was obviously, the design was totally wrong. But within a month, they had jury-rigged these two antennas. Now, they built another one of these on the other side of the Atlantic, at South Wellfleet in North America. And they were a bit worried about that, they've now got this jury-rigged one. They're committed to go over to America, or Marconi is, with Kemp and Paget, going over there. They've set up, Fleming set up the transmitters here, so it can transmit. But the actual technology, if we go to the next one, is pretty fearsome. They've got this, a diesel, not quite, it was called an oil engine. It was a type of diesel. It wasn't quite a diesel engine that drove an alternator that produced about 2,000 volts. They then stepped it up to a transformer to 20,000 volts. They had various capacitors and bits, but they had a huge electrical arc generator here. And that was basically what they did. They had a lot of copper up in the air. They had a big sparky generator at the bottom of it, and they earthed it. And by that, by the crudest way of that, you could produce radio waves. It crackled and it spat. And you could then, receive them, control them with a Morse key and receive them. Now, when they first set it up, it was the most powerful one in the world. And the arc was so fierce that they couldn't do dashes. They couldn't do Morse code dashes. They could only do dots because they were much shorter. So that's why the original message was 3 dots, the letter S in Morse code, ... So that's all Poldhu was doing. So they've jury-rigged this antenna. They've got a transmitter that works, and on the right times of the day, they're sending out ... And Marconi and his colleagues have gone over to St. John's. They'd originally built the station in South Wellfleet, but by this time they're having a bit of a worry. They're having a bit of a tremble about this. So they said, well, we'll go to St. John's in Newfoundland and we'll take a kite and a balloon and we'll put the aerial up with that. And so this is getting really Heath Robinson by this time. So they'd set off on an ocean liner to go to St. John's instead of South Wellfleet, which was actually very opportune because while they were en route, South Wellfleet blew down as well. That fell down. So they couldn't have used it anyway. In perspective, the actual cost of Poldhu, of building Poldhu at the time, was £50,000, which was raised by the board. Now that is a lot of money in those days. You're talking, millions of pounds for an experiment that the whole of the scientific community said wouldn't work. And that's how much faith Marconi managed to get from his board, and probably, how desperate they were to do it. And it was, they didn't announce what they were doing. They built this thing here, and then said, it's just for experiments and communication to ships at sea. And there's actually, if I can find a quote I've got here, Marconi was telling the media that it's rumour that we're going to try and get across the Atlantic, which of course is exactly what they were doing. And of course the outcome was that it was successful. Well, Marconi said it was successful because the only people who heard the 3 dots in St. John's were Marconi and Kemp. There was no independent witness to it at all. But Marconi comes out, faces the media, tells the world that he is now communicated across the North Atlantic. And of course it's great news. He's starting to build up a following by this time. People know his name. And yeah, he's keen to exploit that. So with this sort of Heath Robinson setup, and this, I love these, if you can read that there, it says very dangerous, stand clear, which is a real understatement. Okay, right, so yeah, so we've got to there. Marconi, a little bit about Marconi the man and what brought him to Mullion. here we've got a picture, and I love this picture. This was around about 1902. So they've cleared the site again, and they're building the lattice towers, the 4 lattice towers, which are a bit more iconic. Most of the pictures of Poldhu show that. Yeah, another very positive, important experiments are likely to be carried out with the new poles. It's interesting they call them poles, not aerials or antennas. So yeah, the poles regarding the direction of messages, which are likely to have important bearing on the construction of the new Irish station. So already, Poldhu's not big enough already. They've decided that they need more power. So they've got signals across the North Atlantic, but they haven't got any reliable, marketable communication links, so nothing they can sell. But you can see here that this is a wide spectrum of the local populace. People were walking in from as far as Camborne in some reports, but certainly Porthleven and Helston to come and work on the Poldhu station. So it was pretty important for the local area. And yeah, I think that's probably all I want to say about that. Interestingly, somebody in the village, we were chatting about this the other day, and he said that his grandfather had worked. His grandfather was one of them in there somewhere. He didn't know which. But his grandfather had worked on that, and because he said, and the Marconi company wanted to continue to employ his grandfather then went to Clifton in Ireland, which was their next even bigger radio station. So it wasn't just a casual labour. These people were pursuing careers through it. It was a start off. And yeah, his grandfather actually went out and worked for some time on the Clifton station. Okay. You've got here, this is an idea of the 4 lattice towers. They were about 250 feet, some people say, 220 feet. But they were certainly over 200 feet high. And you could climb up. They had steps up and platforms. Now, in terms of transportation, when Marconi first came here in 1900, you could catch the train from Paddington through Grenier Road to Helston, and then the Great Western Railway provided a horse omnibus, which I think is this one here, out to the Poldhu Hotel, which they owned. It was a Great Western Railway hotel. So they actually owned that, and it was the holiday for very rich people. Influential people came here. Marconi first appeared on his bicycle. He did a lot of walking. He's now you're talking about, he's a 26-year-old man. He's starting to make good contacts around the world, but he's seen around the village on his bicycle, which he did quite a lot of cycling. If I can find a quotation here. Yeah, Marconi loved this Cornish countryside and rode through it on his bicycle, stopping to talk to children along the road and coming back to the inn to tea just in time to watch the changing sunsets. Well, the inn was the Old Inn, and there is a picture of him somewhere outside the Old Inn. So he very much integrated into the village. There was another lovely story around about this time. When the cricket teams met, the Mullion 11 was a man short, so Marconi was asked to play in his place. The quote from the lady who quoted this said, "My father kept the score, and each man came up to give his name. Your father said, Marconi,' and my father said, 'Will you please spell it for me?'" Needless to say, he never forgot it. Because it wasn't shortly afterwards that everybody knew the name Marconi and how to spell it. There was a big cricket luncheon in a huge barn and a meal and laughter and speeches, a lot of friendliness. So Marconi very much integrated into the village life here, and that's an interesting part of his character, because he'd already made friends with Queen Victoria. So he's talking to the good folk of Mullion, and he's also in with royalty as well, because one of the tests, you call it a test, a publicity generating test that he did, was Queen Victoria was staying in Osborne House, and the then Prince of Wales, her son, had injured his leg, and she was very worried about him, but he insisted on going to Cowes to the yacht racing. So Marconi steps in and says, well, if I provide you with a radio link, you can send messages to each other. So, there's a good bit of publicity for Marconi. He's providing Queen Victoria a link to ask her son every day how he's feeling and how his leg is. So those are the sort of things he was doing. The bicycle turned into a Werner motorcycle, and that was rather like one of these little velocette things the French used to, or velos I think they call them, the French used to ride, a little motor over the front wheel of what looked like a push bike. And he rode that around here apparently for a while. And it's sort of generated, he was very much interested in cars. And the next car that he appeared in was a Napier. And it's obviously, you get into quite a nice car now, it's sort of 1902, 1903. And Kemp in his diaries mentions that Marconi came in his new Napier car, and we drove down to the Lizard and then to St Kevin and back again to Mullion. The next day is a little note in Kemp's diary. It says, "Car in pieces in shed." And nobody knows whether he crashed it or whether it just fell to bits. Maybe it was the Cornish roads potholes, maybe, that caused it. But so he went on from there. And his interest in cars actually caused him a bit of trouble in the end. But he moved on from there. He went on to, here we go. Yeah, so that's the 1 horsepower Werner. He came. That was 1903, he arrived in the Napier. 1904, he bought a Mercedes. And by this time, he'd got some friends, and I think they used to do a bit of racing, probably not that fast, but around the roads. And that was around the Poole area of Dorset. He had some particular friends up there. But moving on, quite a few years later, 25th of September 1912, he was driving a Fiat in Italy, near Spezia, and he was involved in a collision, and he lost his right eye. And a lot of people never realised after that Marconi actually only had one good eye. He by that time, he's much more wealthy. He's got more cash to splash out on things, and he went to Murano, where they make all the glass, and his glass eye was made by the best man in the world. And apparently people didn't realise he had a glass eye, so he could, meet them and speak to them. He had that, and obviously, it didn't hold him back too much. Okay, a little bit about his transportation here. Another big event. So, linking really to this Queen Victoria, that got him friends in the royal family. And on the 18th of July, the Prince and Princess of Wales came to Mullion. Well, this was probably the first time that royalty had ever been to Mullion. It was a very big event. They were probably only here for 2 hours, less than 3 hours, something like that, because in the day they came across from Tregothanan. They were staying with Lord Falmouth. They came across from Tregothanan to Poldhu, and took refreshment in the Poldhu Hotel. And these are pictures here. This is the road into the village. That's Domain there, and sort of here would be where the old garage was. So you can see the roads lined And here are the two Rolls Royces coming in. Marconi would be in one, and the Prince and Princess in the other one. And the reports, the newspaper reports, are lovely because the whole village was decked out in bunting and flags. There was obviously quite a lot of competition in the village as to who could, make the best decorations. And you can see, possibly not so easy, but people are very much in their Sunday best here. This is a very big event for the village. So it's, let me find some notes on that, because there are various stories. Let me shouldn't have had so many pages. Royal visit. There we go. Yeah. So it was the soon-to-be King Edward the Seventh who'd injured his leg. So that was the Queen Victoria, and that started the friendship. Now it's Edward the Seventh's son, George, who has become George the Fifth. So this is the Prince of Wales here, and his wife, Princess, and this is Marconi in the boater there. Somewhere in there is Prince Alexander of Teck and General Lord Grenville. So no idea which ones they are.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I can't see so much.
Well, I'm sorry. You're going to have a bit of a problem there with that, I'm afraid. All I can say is we can show these again to anyone who wants to come up and run through them. So this is the Marconi site. Again, you can see, and from that previous picture, the site's all decked out in bunting for it. There is one lovely story. The prince was very interested in radio himself. He could actually read Morse code. He'd been taught Morse code, so he was, a very, very interested person. And they took him to the top of the North Mast, which would have been that one, I think. So there are steps and platforms all the way up, so you can walk up there. One interesting, which I can't be true, there is a report that somebody in the village said that he was actually hoisted up on a bosun's chair. But I think, somebody would have taken a photograph, and I don't think royalty would have stood there. But I wouldn't be surprised if a bosun's chair wasn't used for hoisting riggers up and things like that. But the royal couple set off up the North Tower with Marconi to see the view from the top, because apparently you could see Falmouth from the top of them. She got up to the first or the second landing stage. Now, all the Marconi employees for the big day had been set out in sort of pseudo sailor suits, so very smart to represent the company. And they'd all been told, on no account do you talk to the royal couple unless they speak to you first. And they had positioned these employees in their smart suits on the different landings all the way up the tower. Anyway, the princess got up to the first or the second landing, I'm not too sure, and announced that she wasn't going any further. She was too hot, which she probably was, because you can see the shadows here. It's a sunny day, despite the fluttering of the bunting, and she's got quite a substantial dress on. Well, anyway, there was on this platform the Marconi employee, a Mr. Exelby, apparently. And she announced that she wasn't going any further. And Mr. Exelby said, "Never you mind, my dear. You come and sit down here and I'll look after you." And that apparently is a true story. And she did sit down and he did look after her. And she came back down with the others when they said. But that was obviously a very successful fillip for the village, for Marconi. And they then went off. There was another story about going down. They went across on the King Harry ferry, and the two cars are going down. And obviously, in those days, cars' brakes weren't very good. And Marconi, with his driver, was in the second car, and the royals were in the first one. and the brakes failed on Marconi's car. Now you can imagine the very worst thing you could do is to drive into the back of royalty or overtake them, which would also have been against etiquette. And there's various stories that one says through skillful driving they managed to avoid the collision. Other people say drove it into the hedge, but I think they continued the journey, so I don't think they hit the hedge. Yeah, so there was an interesting day for Mullion there, and a big turnout for that. Now, let's get into the scandalous bit. Marconi was known as a ladies' man. I think it's probably quite nice to put a little bit about it, because it's the man himself, not trying to be destructive of him. Here's a picture of Marconi and his mum. He's 5 or 6 here. And as we said, his mum spoilt him terribly. He was very much sort of mummy's boy. And when she came over to England with him, so she was staying up in Poole in the hotel there. And if I can find the quote there for that. She very much looked after him. Yeah. From the Haven Hotel, she wrote, Marconi's down in Poldhu. After you left this morning, I found you had not taken your rug with you. I sent it to you at 3 o'clock today and hope you will get it all right by tomorrow. I hope you have plenty of blankets on your bed. If not, make them put them on. I put all your things as tidy as possible in your room, and the key to your wardrobe I put in one of the little drawers of your looking glasses on the dressing table. So, yeah. So she's sending you little messages like this. So, yeah. He's very much looked after by his mum. He set up a bit of a pattern of falling in love. You read about Marconi, it's very interesting. There was one comment from one biography that said that he had very few male friends, but a lot of associates. So through his business circles, you could see he's associated with royalty of all parts, because he's meeting with, presidents in the United States. Wherever he goes, by now he's being feted as somebody famous. The thing that really made him famous was the Titanic disaster. One was a lucky escape for him, actually, because he was given free tickets for him and his family on the Titanic. So he had, but because of business pressures, he turned them down and travelled, I think, 4 days before on one of the other liners, because he needed to be in America. And he's flitting across the Atlantic fairly regularly by this time. So he wasn't on board the Titanic, but his radio equipment was. And his radio officers, the 2 radio officers, both Marconi employees. And by that time, it was law that big ships above a certain size had to have radio. So Marconi arrives in America, in New York. He's in the city there. By the time the news of the Titanic sinking comes through. Now, he was personally given the acclaim of having saved those 706 people who were rescued from the Titanic, because it's undoubted, without his radio, we'd still be looking for it. They certainly wouldn't have known where it was or where to look, and all would have perished. So that made him, internationally, there was probably very few people in the world who hadn't heard about that, and Marconi's name is associated right with it. So again, a huge fillip to the company. He, like I say, unfortunately, on 2 occasions coming back from the States on liners, he fell in love. One was Josephine Holland, who by the time he got off in Southampton, he's engaged. The second one was another lady, Inez Mulholland, who was, again, fell in love with her. It was pointed out, it's quite interesting that these ladies he fell in love with tended to be quite feisty women. But the ladies he ended up marrying were far more sort of complicit, didn't, you know, show too much interest in his passion, because he was very much single-mindedly focused on radio and wireless. And this is his first wife. This is Beatrice B. So she's again high-born. I think her father was, he was a baron in Northern Ireland, or in Ireland as it was in those days. So she's well connected. Again, this is his second wife. This is Christina, Maria Christina. So Marconi is a much older man by this time. He's in his 50s here. She was 26 when she married him. He was 52. But in the intervening times, there was this lady here, a Miss Betty Painter. And she came from just the other side of Penzance, so she's almost local girl. There was a big house, well, still is, Boskenna Manor. The other side is near Lamorna, it's back up from Lamorna. And it was a big estate in those days. Her father, a quite eccentric Colonel Painter, owned it. And there was a sort of commune of strange people, if you like. But a lot of famous people came down, but it was known as a place where there was a lot of partying went on, and sort of decadent living. It was far enough out of London that it was far enough from the press that people... And his daughter, his only daughter, Betty, here, Marconi became a visitor down there. I don't think he originally visited for Betty. But he fell in love with Betty. And there was rumours of his engagement. So again, you've got Marconi here. By this time, he's divorced his first wife. That didn't work out well. They had 4 children in all, 3 of whom survived. But Marconi, because he was always away, by this time he's always off on his boat, because he had the Electra, his private boat. He's off flitting around the world on Marconi business, on wireless business. And he was a bit of a conflict in character, in that he was very jealous of his wife and was wanting to know who she was with. But on the other hand, he had a lot of lady friends as well. So that was a bit of a difficult one. And in the end, it didn't work out with Beatrice. They had by this time moved into the sort of higher levels of Italian society. She was actually became a lady in waiting to the Italian king. So yeah, they're mixing high up. And Marconi, I think he sort of had a bit of a midlife crisis really with young Betty. But he used to turn up apparently bring his ship into Falmouth or into Penzance, and there's some lovely pictures, because I mean the ship's 220 foot long. We'll talk about it a bit in a minute. Quite impressive. So yeah, fortunately it didn't come to anything. He bought her lots of gifts and things, and eventually took her for a 3-month cruise around the Mediterranean on his yacht. But her father said that if she was going to go with this man on the cruise, her mother was going to go as the chaperone. And her mother went and spent the time. And there was an ugly rumour going around afterwards that the interest from Marconi was in the mother rather than the daughter. Yeah, yes, that's just a rumour, but it might hold water. I don't know, but certainly it's quite interesting that her mother Ethel was the first person to talk via telephony with a radio telephone from Poldhu to Australia, and that was her mother. So, yeah, but it all ended very quickly. I think possibly Marconi saw sense in this and cut his ties. Okay, so we move on, and we talk about Marconi's ship Electra. Okay, where are you going? 220-foot long ship. It was built for the Habsburgs, the Archduke and his wife, in 1904. So it was built as a luxury liner for royalty, basically. It went through the hands of another couple of important business people before the First World War, when it was impressed into the Royal Navy. It was bought by the Royal Navy and used as a boat, sort of minesweeping or something in the North Sea. After the First World War, it was put up for sale, and that's when Marconi came along, looking for. He was very interested in boats always along, but I think he was looking for seclusion as well by this time. So he turned it into a floating laboratory and sailed it around the world, did some quite valuable experiments. But it was also a bit of Marconi's, it was a bit of a party boat, because, I mean, he'd taken young Betty out on it for a cruise, a 3-month cruise around the Med. But he also entertained a lot of statesmen, kings, queens, presidents. So it was very useful, and the company paid for it for him. And you can see it's got extra tall masts for the radio aerials there. The ship went on, I think I read he bought that for £30,000 after the First World War, which nowadays doesn't sound a lot of money. But anyway, it went on after he died. It was bought by the Italians, and I believe they used it in the Second World War. And when Italy fell, the armistice in the Second World War, it was impressed into the German Navy, into the Kriegsmarine. And they fitted it out with some guns and things on it. And on its first cruise out in the Adriatic, we sunk it. So it was, I'm not too sure. Some reports say it was the Royal Air Force, some say it was the Royal Navy, but we sunk it for the Germans. And it was, the Italians tried to save it actually, but they cut it up. Some of the sections are actually on display in Italy. I think the bow section is actually at the Villa Grifoni, where Marconi was brought up. So that's the ship, and we come to a sort of more controversial time of Marconi. This is the latter years. By this time, he's not being seen much around here. To some extent, the Brits managed to drive him away from Britain. There was, just before the First World War, what they called the Marconi scandal. And that involved the government, the Marconi company, everybody except Marconi, actually. The name went the Marconi scandal. And it was all to do with insider trading. Marconi shares, which were rocketing after the Titanic and after some other agreements they got in North America. And also the post office over here were coming into the idea. Marconi had proposed this network of communications around the empire. It was the Imperial Relay Scheme, and it was going to set up these huge radio stations around the world to keep the empire in touch. The British Post Office had bought into this idea. It was taken to the government because it needed government approval, but in the meantime there was these shares being traded, and of course the shares were rocketing in value because of this new contract, and there was great cries of insider dealing. And I think it soured Marconi's sort of relationship. He was actually absolved of any responsibility. He wasn't involved in this at all. His name was clear, but it got known as the Marconi scandal. And I think it sort of soured his relationship. And from that point on, he went back to Italy to serve in the First World War, because Italy was actually on the same side as us then. He went back and joined the Italian Navy, and he became more and more involved with Italian diplomacy. And he was actually in the Italian delegation at the Treaty of Versailles, trying to sort out things after the First World War. And he became less and less involved. Well, of course, the problem was that Italy at this time, he's spending more time in Italy, and Italy is becoming a fascist state. So unfortunately, Marconi he's marked as a fascist, and he was. But the whole question is out there it's still being debated about how much he was just a businessman doing business with the fascists, or how much he was involved. But with no support to them, here's the disgraceful dictator there, whose name escapes me for the moment, Mussolini. Yeah. So this is on board. This is Marconi and Mussolini. Now, Mussolini visited his yacht a couple of times. Marconi was selling this same scheme for global communication to the Italians as well. But then you see, here's Marconi. He's been decorated. He's a senator, it's sort of high up in government. Got a lot of badges and sashes and things. This is the king, another man he's associating with, King Emmanuel III, Victor Emmanuel III, King of Italy. This gentleman here is his father-in-law. So this Marconi here, that's his wife. That's Christina Marconi, so his second wife. But this is his father-in-law. Now, he's high up in the Vatican. He's what they call black nobility. So they were he was a sort of major or something, a brigadier or something. But he was very high up with the Pope. So you can see the circles Marconi's mixing in. And here, this gentleman here is the Pope. Okay, that's Pope Pius XI. And Marconi here, and this radio, because he set up for the Pope the first Vatican radio station, the first global radio network. He beat the BBC to it by a year. The BBC World Service didn't start until the year after. So you can see no excuse for Marconi being a fascist, but you can see the circles he was mixing in. He was very much a nationalist. He was, for Italy. He was born in Italy. And yeah, I don't know what more you can say, really. There's no excuse for it. But if he was going to do business in Italy, these were the people he had to deal with. Interestingly, going back to the Pope, I'll stop in a minute, don't worry. Going back to the Pope, of course, he was married to his first wife in a Protestant ceremony, and of course he divorced her. So he was divorced, married and divorced. Then he falls in love with Maria Christina, who, like I said, her father is very high up in the Church of Rome, where divorce isn't allowed. So it's a bit of a quandary here. Marconi wants to marry her, but he's not allowed to. And it went right up to a sort of papal decree to annul his first marriage. So basically they said his first marriage had never happened because it was never right. So he's working with the Pope to get his marriage through. I'm tempted to say let's leave it at that, but I do have a quirk of Marconi and his ladies. He was possibly a very lonely man. He admitted in letters to his wife that he was lonely, and he was looking for love, and I think he probably found it in Christina. And you're talking about this a 50-year-old man. This is his second daughter. This is Princess Electra. Yeah, most people name their boats after their daughter. This Marconi named his daughter after his boat. She was born after the boat. Anyway, she is still alive. She's in the late 90s now, but she is still alive. But there's a letter here, or an extract of a letter. No, this is a 50-year-old man writing to his 20s, she's probably about 27, 28-year-old wife there. And he could be 14 or 15 if you read this. He says, "Before giving thanks once again to God because you exist, I want to repeat to you that I'm happy, happy in our special and extraordinary love, happy because the days are passing and bringing us closer to even happier days, when I'll no longer have to leave you, when we'll be at one, when you will be my constant comfort and my dear sweet guide, when I'll have the right and the privilege to protect you, and the world will have to respect and admire our love. There you go. Possibly a little insight to the man, and we can only hope that he died a happy man, happily married. He was only 63, which is not particularly old. He had a life which was beset by illness. He had malaria for a long period of his life, which obviously kept recurring. There's people saying that he was suffering from depression as well, because he disappeared, and some of it being disappeared onto his boat. And even his wives say that he was sort of distant and unapproachable at times, and they weren't sort of sure whether he was sort of focused on inventing something, or whether he was just switching off altogether. A very interesting man, and like I say, a man who has certainly changed all our lives. And when you think he was messing around with radar, he was messing around with radio location, with actually positioning, triangulating boat positions off two radio stations. There's so much, and you could go on here. I mean, when the balloon station was at Mullion, the Mullion balloon station, he had radio transmitters on those balloons, on hydrogen balloons with spark transmitters. Sounds pretty dodgy, but that was the way it was. So he had radio transmitters, and at Mile End, on the road to the Lizard there was a beacon, a Marconi beacon, and they used that as a homing beacon, basically to get back to Mullion, because they were way out in the channel somewhere looking for submarines. So there's all these things that he was proposing mobile phones back in the 20s. So he was way ahead, but he didn't invent much. He was developing and pushing the boundaries, and making things work and selling them. Okay. So I think that probably about rounds up Marconi, just to say that is the Villa Grifoni. That's where he was born. That's the loft he did his first experiments in. This fairly hideous monstrosity in the garden is his mausoleum, which was built by Mussolini as a pretty hideous. His funeral procession was, I think they were saying, something like a mile long through Rome when he died in 1937. And they said, the quote is that there were 500,000 people lining the streets to see him gone. And the radio stations, or most radio stations around the world, had a 2-minute silence, radio silence for him. So that was Marconi. He came to Mullion. Interestingly, he didn't leave an awful lot here. Most of it got cleared away. There's the monument with the Marconi symbol on the top. Everyone thinks it's the Batman symbol. It's not. If you go and look at it closely, it's a globe with the M for Marconi spanning it. Interestingly, if you look at the inscriptions on there, they go out of their way to name the other greats who worked from Pole Jew. It mentions, obviously, it says Marconi received the letter S at Newfoundland, and the transatlantic radio telegraphy. The station went on until 1933, so it had a 33-year life, and it was mostly experimental work that was done. But it does mention that Charles Samuel Franklin, he was the man who built the aerials. He was the expert on aerials. So in 1923 and 24, he did the beam, focusing the energy in a beam. to Marconi on his yacht, and they also mention some of the other Ambrose Fleming. Don't mention Kemp, sadly. He ought to have a mention, really, because he worked for the Marconi Company until he died in 1933, but not long before that he was still working for the Marconi Company. There we go. I think we'll leave it there for you, because I can ramble on about this for hours. So you're looking for a cup of tea. But if we can have another go at a bit of technology, which may or may not work. The little red light on there. Oh yes, the little red light. Right, if I press that button, press that, and we'll end with a great man himself, which is a bit.
But I placed a single earphone to my ear and started listening. The receiver on the table before me was very crude, with few coils and condensers and a coherer. No valves, no amplifiers, not even a crystal. The chief question was whether wireless waves would be stopped by the curvature of the Earth. All along I had been convinced that this was not so, but some eminent men held that the roundness of the Earth would prevent communication over such a great distance as across the Atlantic. The first and final answer to that question came at 12:30, when I heard
and that was it. Okay, thank you.